It's a reflection of the fact that a lot of people are worried about these issues and have a right to be.
Exactly. I think so.
The only thing to do is to go beyond being worried about them to doing something about them, because it doesn't have to happen.
And that's part of what I'd like to ask you about. I'd like to ask you to turn your attention, in the light of your comments tonight, to Latin America, and specifically to the country of Colombia and what's going on there, and the purported rationale for the ratcheting up of U.S. military support, the purported rationale being the supposed war against drugs, and a neighboring country to Colombia, which is the nation of Peru. And I have a particular reason for wanting to ask you about Peru, which is that there is an American woman who was a student here at MIT, whose name is Lori Berenson, who's been in prison in Peru for over 3 years now, without a trial. And perhaps in your comments about Colombia and Peru, you might also have something to say about her situation.
Well, there's really two questions. One is about Lori Berenson, who was a student here a couple of years ago and is now in a prison in Peru without trial. You know, that's something we really could do something about. I mean, pressure by the U.S. government, meaning pressure from the population on the U.S. government on Peru, would deal with that case. No question about that. So that's a simple choice. You know, you can do things about it or not. Choice is open. The more general question about the whole Andean region, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, has to do with several things. There has been a Colombia, which Jack's point is that the U.S. is now increasing its military aid to Colombia. Actually, Colombia has been one of the leading recipients of U.S. military aid right through the 90s, going up under Clinton. It's also the most violent country in the hemisphere. There are, well, State Department reports would suggest that about 10 people a day are victims of political violence, has well over 1 million internal refugees. Most of the violence is attributed to paramilitaries, including by the State Department. Paramilitaries are essentially a front for the military and the landowners. Other atrocities are the military directly. There are also guerrilla atrocities. But the large majority are government and paramilitary. They're all connected to, in complicated, not so complicated ways, to land ownership, resource control, now in the last years, narco trafficking, and so on. And the U.S. is fighting what it calls a drug war, including, incidentally, biological warfare. So new fungicides are being introduced. Nobody knows what effect they'll have. They're supposed to kill coca, but something else happens, not our business. Crop spraying, just government and paramilitary violence. Everyone knows that the paramilitaries and the military are tied up with the drug traffic. Just a couple of months ago, a Columbia Air Force plane was picked up, one of the Air Force commanders, full of drugs. This is happening all through the region, incidentally. The presidential jet of the president of Nicaragua was recently the subject of a major scandal in Nicaragua, kept out of the press here because he's our boy. And it was found that it was the jet was being used for drug transport from, you know, Miami to wherever, going through Nicaragua, which has become a major drug transit area ever since the U.S. took it over in 1990. But Colombia is a much bigger one. The whole drug war, you can't really talk about the tactics, in my opinion, because the whole thing is conceived in a way which, you know, has a kind of a rationality from the point of view of those who are executing the war, but it has no rationality from a human point of view. So from a human point of view, the drug problem is in the United States. In fact, the U.S. is the major, maybe the major producer, or one of the major producers of the drug that's the substance, as it's called, that's most rapidly increasing, namely synthetics. They're made right here. Even the drugs that are produced in the Andes are produced with U.S. chemicals. The money mostly goes through U.S. banks. the drug problem, as it's called, is largely a manufactured problem. So if you want to figure out what it's like, the peak of marijuana, there has never, take say marijuana, there has never been any medical evidence presented that it's probably not good for you. You know, just like meat isn't good for you, or coffee or something. I'm sure it's not good for you. But the evidence about it is extremely slim. Certainly no medical evidence was presented to justify its being criminalized. In fact, the American Medical Association never favored it. The criminalization was a different thing, has an interesting history. The peak use, forgetting the criminalization, the peak use of marijuana, as I'm remembering figures, so like they may not be exactly right, but something like this, was around 1980. And the criminalization level was very low. The reason was quite straightforward. It was people like you know, and they don't get sent to jail, or their parents make a fuss and do things about it, and so on. So those guys don't go to jail. Through the 1980s, two things were happening. Use of substances over a very broad range was declining among educated people, and that's very broad. Marijuana, hard drugs, coffee, tobacco, red meat, you know, big spectrum of stuff. It was declining. I mean, all sorts of changes in lifestyle. But it was remaining steady, or maybe even increasing, among poor people, which means, and there's a close, the United States is almost alone in the industrial world in that though it has statistics on everything, it does not have statistics on class. That's an ideological decision. So you can't get figures on class out of the Census Bureau. You have to reconstruct them in some fashion, unlike other countries. But there is a close class-race correlation. And among the poor, and hence heavily among minorities, there was either steady or increasing use of the substances. Well, you take a look at the trend lines and ask yourself when the drug war was called, and it was approximately when they crossed. So you could predict victory in the drug war among educated people because the trend lines were already going down, so they'll continue going down. And you could also predict what was pointed out by Senator Moynihan. Not my favorite character, but he does happen to be one of the few senators who paid attention to social statistics, a social scientist, and he pointed out that we are determining to declare a war, an rise in crime, or something like that, among minorities. We're determining to declare a crime wave among minorities. That's exactly what we're doing by declaring the drug war. And I think it was done, and I think it was done for reasons of social policy. This is a superfluous population. They are the counterpart of the Colombian disposables, disposable people. And you want a crime war among them for two reasons. For one thing, because you can get rid of them, toss them into jail, and for another thing, because you can frighten everybody else. And that's important. Crime in general is in the United States, it's a kind of a political construct. The crime in the United States is not very different from other industrial countries, with the single exception of killings with guns, which is a special thing about the gun laws and the gun culture. But apart from that, it's kind of at the high end of other industrial societies. Fear of crime, on the other hand, is way beyond other societies. And it's manufactured. It's manufactured by politicians, it's one of the very few countries in which politicians stand up and debate about who's going to be tougher on crime. Elsewhere, crime is considered a problem. It's like cancer or something. You try to deal with it, but you don't decide who's going to be tougher on it. In the United States, you argue about who's going to be tougher on it. Back around 1980, the United States was pretty much like other industrial societies, again, sort of at the high end, in incarceration rates. Since then, it's gone way up. By the end of the Reagan years, it was like 5 to 10 times as high, still going up, mostly a reflection of the war on drugs, mostly victimless crimes, possession of some sort or another, which has given extraordinary sentences. That's one of the human rights violations for which the United States is regularly condemned by the human rights organizations. The outrageous sentencing for victimless crimes, which is just targeting poor and the disposable people and frightening the rest. So, instrument of social control. You go over to the Andes, the places where coke is being produced, well, there you find another story. So Colombia, for example, was once a wheat exporter. And why isn't it a wheat exporter anymore? Well, the U.S. flooded it with subsidized U.S. agro-exports. It was called Food for Peace back in the 50s. And it undermined the Colombian wheat industry. They're not exporting anymore. Same thing happened elsewhere. Colombia is a coffee exporter. But coffee is not very good for small peasants for a very simple reason. The U.S. refused to permit arrangements among the producers to keep prices stable. Now, if prices, fluctuate all over the place, it doesn't hurt agribusiness. I mean, they got enough of a, they own enough other things and so on, so they can make out if coffee prices go down. If you're a small peasant, you can't do that. You got to feed your kids tomorrow. Price goes down too low, you're dead. So that drove people out of coffee production, out of wheat production, out of other production. Well, where'd they go? Well, they were being taught a lesson. It's called structural adjustment, all throughout neoliberalism, all throughout this region. The lesson is stop producing things for local consumption, like, say, food. We can do that cheaper with subsidized agribusiness. You be a rational peasant. Produce for agro-export and produce what's going to make the most money in agro-export. That's a rational peasant. That's following the rules. Well, they did. You're a rational peasant, you produce cocoa. Grows well, makes a ton of money, and so on. So one part of U.S. policy is trying to drive the population towards producing drugs, and the other part of U.S. policy is to murder them if they do it. That's the support for the military and the counterinsurgency and so on. And those two policies are going on side by side. And they don't have anything to do with drugs in the United States. I mean, do that stuff as much as you want. The drug price remains stable, the quantity of drugs remains stable, and so on. This is an internal U.S. problem having to do with serious social problems inside U.S. society. And furthermore, it is well known and agreed by criminologists and other specialists across the board that the best way to deal with serious drug problems is education. But that's, you don't spend money on that because that has no use as for social control or for eliminating disposable people. So I don't think talking about the tactics of the drug war makes a lot of sense. The whole thing is constructed in a way which is totally insane except for rich people like New York banks, where most of the money flows through. And so what's happening to the money? It's an interesting question. Of course, it's illegal, so nobody tracks it. Actually, you could track it. So the U.S., especially with computers and so on, the Federal Reserve System, which is well regulated, requires notification of large deposits. Last time I looked, it was over $10,000. So, if a lot of money is suddenly coming in, they tell right away. And in fact, there was an effort by federal prosecutors back in the early 80s to carry out some, entrapment exercise against banks in southern Florida, which were suddenly piling up a huge amount of money for reasons that nobody doubted. It was called off, however. It was called Operation Greenback. It was called off by the Reagan administration's drug czar, George Bush. That was called off. So the money's supposed to come into U.S. banks. Where's it go? Well, take a look sometime. This is a guess. Nobody's ever studied it. But the U.S. Department of Commerce does publish regularly, I think quarterly, tons of details about everything you can imagine. And one of them is foreign direct investment, FDI. You take a look at the record. I haven't done this for a year or two, but I was doing it for a couple of years in the mid-'90s. You take a look at the FDI for Latin America, for the hemisphere. Canada is a separate category. That's like Europe. But take the rest of the hemisphere minus Canada. Look at foreign direct investment. It turns out that regularly about 25% of it was going to Bermuda. About 15% was going to the British Islands. About 10% to Panama. So that's roughly 50% of what's called foreign direct investment. And this is the period of the emerging markets. Everybody's excited about the emerging markets. So about half of it was going to these places. Well, what was it for? Certainly wasn't building steel mills and automobile plants. There aren't many of them in Bermuda. There is a kind of benign interpretation. It's just a way of ripping off the public by, evading taxes. So that just harms poor people. There's a less benign interpretation, which is possible and might be discovered if anybody bothered to look at it,